Mysteries await just a page away. Ready to dive in? Welcome to The Book Reader, where stories unfold one enchanting page at a time. Subscribe now and unlock the magic.
Night Without End by Alistair MacLean. Night Without End.
Chapter 9, Wednesday, 8 p.m., Thursday, 4 p.m. We were on our way again just after 9 o'clock that night. It had been my original intention, by dreaming up a variety of excuses and even, if necessary, by sabotaging the engine, to stay there for several hours, or at least what I reckoned to be the longest possible time before the killers became restive, suspected that I was deliberately stalling, and took over, or tried to take over, for it had been my further intention that after an hour or two, Jack Straw should produce his rifle. It was strapped to his shoulders night and day, and I my automatic, and hold them all at the point of the gun until Hillcrest came up. If all had gone well, he should have been with us by midnight. Our troubles would have been over. But it had not gone well. Our troubles were as bad as ever. The Snowcat was bogged down, and with Mahler now seriously ill and Marie Lugard frighteningly weak and exhausted, I couldn't remain any longer. Had I been made of tougher stuff, or even had I not been a doctor, I might have brought myself to recognize that both Marie Lugard and Theodore Mahler were expendable pawns in a game where the stakes, I was now certain, were far greater than just the lives of one or two people. I might have held everybody, or the major suspects, at least at gunpoint until such time, 24 hours if need be, as Hillcrest did come up. But I could not bring myself to regard our sick passengers as expendable pawns. A weakness, no doubt, but one that I was almost proud to share with Jack Straw, who felt exactly as I did. That Hillcrest would come up eventually, I felt pretty sure. The dumping of the sugar in the petrol. I bit my lips in chagrin whenever I remembered that it had been I who had told them all that Hillcrest was running short of fuel. Had been a brilliant move, but nothing more, now, than I had come to expect of men who thought of everything, made every possible provision against future eventualities. Still, even though furiously angry at the delay, Hillcrest had thought he could cope with the situation. The big cabin of the Snowcat was equipped with a regular workshop with tools fit to deal with just about every mechanical breakdown, and already his driver mechanic. One didn't envy him his murderous task, even though he was reportedly working behind heated canvas aprons, had stripped down the engine, and was cleaning pistons, cylinder walls, and valves of the unburnt carbon deposits that had finally ground the big tractor to a halt. A couple of others had rigged up a makeshift distillation unit, a petrol drum, almost full, with a thin metal tube packed in ice leading from its top to an empty drum. Petrol, Hillcrest had explained, had a lower boiling point than sugar, and when the drum was heated, the evaporating gas, which would cool in the ice-packed tube, should emerge as pure petrol. Such, at least, was the theory, although Hillcrest didn't seem absolutely sure of himself. He had asked if we had any suggestion whether we could help him in any way at all, but I had said we couldn't. I was tragically, unforgivably wrong. I could have helped, for I knew something that no one else did. But at the moment, I completely forgot it. And because I forgot, nothing could now avert the tragedy that was to come, or save the lives of those who were about to die. My thoughts were black and bitter as the tractor roared and lurched and clattered its way southwest by west under the deepening darkness of a sky that was slowly beginning to fill with cloud. A dark depression filled me and a cold rage, and there was room in my mind for both. I had a strange sense of impending disaster, and though I was doctor enough to know that it was almost certainly a psychologically induced reaction to the cold, exhaustion, sleeplessness, and hunger, and a physical reaction to the blow on the head, nevertheless, I could not shake it off. And I was angry because I was helpless. I was helpless to do anything to protect any of the innocent people with me, the people who had entrusted themselves to my care, the sick Mahler and Marie Lagarde, the quiet young German girl, the grave-faced Margaret Ross. Above all, I had to admit to myself, Margaret Ross. I was helpless because I knew the murderers might strike at any time. For all I knew, they might believe that Hillcrest had already told me all I needed to know, Anna, that I was just waiting my chance to catch them completely off guard. On the other hand, they, too, were almost certainly just biding their time, not knowing how much I knew, but just taking a calculated gamble, letting things ride as long as the tractor kept moving, kept heading in the right direction, but prepared to strike once and for all when the time came. And above all, I was helpless because I still had no definite idea as to who the killers were. For the 100th time, I went over everything I could remember, everything that had happened, everything that had been said, trying to dredge up from the depths of memory one single fact, one isolated word that would point the finger in one unmistakable direction. But I found nothing. Of the 10 passengers Jack Straw and I had with us, 6 of them, I felt certain, were almost beyond suspicion. Margaret Ross and Marie Lagarde were completely beyond it. The only things that could be said against Mrs. Dansby Gregg and Helene was that I hadn't absolute proof of their innocence. But I was certain that such proof was quite unnecessary. United States senators, as recent bribery and corruption cases had lamentably shown, had as many human failings, especially cupidity, as the next man. But even so, the idea of a senator getting mixed up with murder and criminal activities on this massive scale was too preposterous to bear further examination. As for Mahler, I was quite aware that being a diabetic didn't bar a man from criminal pursuits, and he could have been one of the guilty men, just possibly. He had thought they would force land near some easily available insulin supplies. But that was just a little too far-fetched, and even if it weren't, I wasn't seriously interested in Mahler. I was concerned with killers who might kill again at any moment, and he most certainly wasn't included in that category. Mahler was a dying man. That left only Zagero, Solly Levin, Corazzini, and the Rev Smallwood, and the Rev Smallwood was too good not to be true. The Bible was hardly ever out of his hands these days. There were certain lengths to which any impostor might reasonably be expected to go to convince us of his identity, but lengths such as these passed the bounds of the superfluous into the realms of the ridiculous. I had reason to suspect Corazzini. As a tractor specialist, he knew precious little about tractors, although I had to be fair and admit that Citroën and Global tractors were a quarter of a century different in time and a world different in design. But he had been the only person I had found on his feet when I had opened the door of the passenger cabin in the plane. It was he who, back in the IGY cabin, had questioned me so closely about Hillcrest's movements. It was he I had learned who had helped Jack Straw and Zagero bring up the petrol from the tunnel, and so had the opportunity to spike the stuff left behind. Finally, I believed he could be utterly ruthless, but there was one great point in his favor. That still bandaged hand, token of his desperate attempt to save the falling radio. I had far greater reason to suspect Zagero, and by implication of friendship, Solly Levin. Zagero had inquired of Margaret Ross when dinner was a damning point. Solly Levin had been nearest the radio, and in the right position for doing the damage when it had been destroyed. Another damning point. Zagero had been one of those working with the petrol. And most damning of all, Zagero bore no more resemblance to a boxer than Levin did to any boxing manager who had ever lived outside the pages of Damon Runyon. And as a further negative mark against Zagero, I had Margaret Ross's word that Corazzini had never left a seat in the plane. That didn't, of course, necessarily exclude Corazzini. He could well have had an accomplice. But who could that accomplice be? It was not until then that the chilling, frightening thought struck me that because 2 guns had been used in the plane, I had assumed all along that there were only 2 criminals. There wasn't a shadow of evidence to suggest why there should not be more than 2. Why not 3? Why not Corazzini, Zagero, and Levin all in the conspiracy together? I thought over the implications of this for some minutes, and at the end I felt more helpless than ever, more weirdly certain of ultimate tragedy to come. Forcibly, almost, I had to remind myself that all 3 were not necessarily working together, but it was a possibility that had to be faced. About 3 o'clock in the morning, still following the flagged trail that stretched out interminably before us in the long rake of the headlights, we felt the tractor slow down and Jackstraw, who was driving at the time, change gear as we entered on the first gentle slope of the long foothills that led to the winding pass that cut the Vindeby Nunataks almost exactly in half. We could have gone round the Nunataks, but that would have wasted an entire day, perhaps 2, and with the 10-mile route through the hills clearly marked, it was pointless to make a detour. 2 hours later, as the incline perceptibly steepened, the tractor treads began to slip and spin on the frozen snow, but by offloading almost all the petrol and gear we carried on the tractor sled and stowing it inside the tractor cabin, we managed to build up enough weight to gain a purchase on the surface. Even so, progress was slow and difficult. We could only make ground by following a zigzag pattern, and it took us well over an hour to cover the last mile before the entrance to the pass. Here we halted soon after 7 o'clock in the morning. The pass was lined on one side by a deep crevasse in the ice that ran its entire length, and although not particularly treacherous, the trail was difficult and dangerous enough to make me determined to wait for the 2 or 3 brief hours, light, at the middle of the day. While breakfast was being prepared, I looked at Mahler and Marie Lugard. The steady rise in temperature, it was now less than as Soti, had done nothing to help either of them. Marie Lugard looked as if she hadn't eaten in weeks. Her face, pockmarked with sores and frostbite blisters, was appallingly thin and wasted, and the once sparkling eyes lackluster, pouched and filled and rimmed with blood. She hadn't spoken a word in 10 hours, just sat there, in her increasingly rare moments of waking, shivering and staring ahead with sightless eyes. Theodore Mahler looked in better case than she, but I knew when his defenses went down they would do so in a matter of hours. Despite all that we, or rather Margaret Ross, had done for him, the insidious talons of frostbite had already sunk deep into his feet. He had developed a very heavy cold, rare indeed in the Arctic. The seeds of it must have been sown before he had left New York, and he had neither the energy nor reserves to fight either that or the boils that were beginning to plague him. His breathing was difficult, the sweet, ethereal odor of acetone very strong. He seemed wide awake and rational enough. Superficially, a much better going concern than Marie Lagarde, but I knew that the collapse, the preliminary to the true diabetic coma, might come at any time. At 8 o'clock jackstraw, and I moved out onto the hillside, and again made contact with Hillcrest. My heart sank when I heard the grim news that they'd hardly progressed a couple of miles in the previous 12 hours. In that bitter cold, it seemed, and where they were temperatures were all of 30 degrees lower than they were with us, heating up an 8-gallon drum of petrol. Even using stoves, blow lamps, and every means at their disposal to the point of boiling was a heartbreakingly slow job, and the snowcat gobbled up in a minute all the pure fuel they could distill in 30 times that. Beyond that, there was no news. A Plavnik, which they had contacted less than an hour previously, had still nothing fresh to report. Without a word, jackstraw and I packed up the equipment and made our way back to the cabin of the tractor. Jackstraw's almost invariable Eskimo cheerfulness was at the lowest ebb I had ever seen. He seldom spoke now, and even more rarely smiled. As for me, I felt our last hope was gone. We started up the tractor again at 11 o'clock and headed straight into the pass, myself at the wheel. I was the only person left in either the driving compartment or the cabin behind. Mahler and Marie Lagarde vanished under a great mound of clothing, rode on the dog sled while the others walked. The tractor was wide, the trail narrow and sometimes sloping outwards and downwards, and with a side slip into the gaping crevasse that bordered our path, nobody inside the cabin would have had any chance of escape. The first part was easy. The trail, sometimes not more than 8 or 9 feet broad, more often than not opened out into a shelf wide enough almost to be called the flat floor of a valley, and we made rapid progress. At noon I'd warned Hillcrest that we would be traversing the Vindeby noon attacks then, and would have to miss our regular radio schedule. We were more than halfway through, and had just entered the narrowest and most forbidding defile in the entire crossing when Corzini came running up alongside the tractor and waved me down to a stop. I suppose he must have been shouting, but I'd heard nothing above the steady roar of the engine. And of course I'd seen nothing because they had all been behind me, and the width of the tractor cabin made my driving mirror useless. "Trouble, Doc," he said swiftly, just as the engine died. "Someone's gone over the edge. Come on, quick." "Who?" I jumped out of the seat, forgetting all about the gun I habitually carried in the door compartment as an insurance against surprise attack when I was driving. "How did it happen?" "The German girl." We were running side by side round a corner in the track towards the little knot of people 40 yards back, clustering round a spot on the edge of the crevasse. "Slipped, fell, I dunno, your friend's gone over after her." "Gone after her?" I knew that crevasse was virtually bottomless. Good God! I pushed Brewster and Levin to one side, peered gingerly over the edge into the blue-green depths below, then drew in my breath sharply. To the right, as I looked, the gleaming walls of the crevasse, their top 10 feet glittering with a beaded crystalline substance like icing sugar, and here not more than 7 or 8 feet apart, stretched down into the illimitable darkness, curving away from one another to form an immense cavern the size of which I couldn't even begin to guess at. To the left, more directly below, at a depth of perhaps 20 feet, the two walls were joined by a snow and ice bridge, maybe 15 feet long, one of the many that dotted the crevasse through its entire length. Jack Straw was standing on this pressed closely into one edge, holding an obviously dazed Helene in the crook of his right arm. It wasn't hard to work out Jack Straw's presence there. Normally, he was far too careful a man to venture near a crevasse without a rope, and certainly far too experienced to trust himself to the treachery of a snow bridge. But when Helene had stumbled over the edge, she must have fallen heavily, almost certainly in an effort to protect her broken collarbone, and when she had risen to her feet had been so dazed that Jack Straw, to prevent her staggering over the edge of the snow bridge to her death, had taken the near-suicidal gamble of jumping after her to stop her. Even in that moment, I wondered if I would have had the courage to do the same myself. I didn't think so. "Are you all right?" I shouted. "I think my left arm is broken," Jack Straw said conversationally. "Would you please hurry, Dr. Mason? This bridge is rotten, and I can feel it going." His arm broken and the bridge going, and indeed I could see chunks of ice and snow falling off from the underside of the arch on which he was standing. The matter-of-fact lack of emotion of his voice was more compelling than the most urgent cry could possibly have been. But for the moment, I was in the grip of a blind panic that inhibited all feeling, all thought except the purely destructive. Ropes. But Jack Straw couldn't tie a rope round himself, not with an arm gone. The girl couldn't help herself either. Both of them were helpless. Somebody would have to go down to them, and go at once. Even as I stared into the crevasse, held in this strange motionless thrall, a large chunk of Neve 6 broke off from the side of the bridge and plummeted slowly down into the depths to vanish from sight, perhaps 200 feet below, long before we heard it strike the floor of the crevasse. I jumped up and raced towards the tractor sled. How to belay the man who was lowered? With only 8 or 9 feet between the edge of the crevasse and the cliff behind, not more than 3 men could get behind a rope, and with perhaps 2 men dangling at the end of it, what possible purchase could those 3 find on that ice-hard snow to support them, far less pull them up? They would be pulled over the edge themselves. Spikes drive a spike into the ground and anchor a rope to that. But heaven only knew how long it would take to drive a spike into the icy surface with no guarantee at the end that the ice wouldn't crack and refuse to hold, and all the time that snow bridge crumbling under the feet of the 2 people who were depending on me to save their lives. The tractor, I thought desperately, perhaps the tractor, that would take any weight. But by the time we disconnected the tractor sled, pushed it over the edge, and slowly backed the tractor along that narrow and treacherous path, it would have been far too late. I literally stumbled upon the answer, the 4 big wooden bridging battens sticking out from the end of the tractor sled. God, I must have been crazy not to think of them straight away. I grabbed a coil of nylon rope, hauled out one of the battens, Zagaroa's already beside me pulling at another, and ran back to the spot as fast as I could. That 3-inch thick, 11-foot-long batten must have weighed over 100 pounds. But such is the supernormal strength given us in moments of desperate need that I brought it sweeping over and had it in position astride the crevasse, directly above Jack Straw and Helene, as quickly and surely as if I had been handling a half-inch plank. Seconds later, Zagero had laid the second batten alongside mine. I stripped off fur gloves and mittens, tied a double bowline in the end of the nylon rope, slipped my legs through the 2 loops, made a quick half-hitch round my waist, shouted for another rope to be brought, moved out and tied my own rope to the middle of the planks. allowing for about 20 feet of slack, and lowered myself down hand over hand until I was standing beside Jackstraw and Helene. I could feel the snow bridge shake under my feet even as I touched it, but I'd no time to think about that. It would have been fatal if I had even begun to. Think about it. Another rope came snaking down over the edge, and in seconds I had it tied round Helene's waist so tightly that I could hear her gasp with the pain of it. But this was no time for taking chances. And whoever held the other end of the rope up above was moving even as quickly as I was, for the rope tightened just as I finished tying the knot. I learned later that Helene owed her life to Mahler's quick thinking. The dog sledge carrying Marie Lagarde and himself had stopped directly opposite the spot where Helene had gone over, and he had shouted to Brewster and Margaret Ross to sit on it and thread the rope through the slats on the sledge top. It had been a chance, but one that came off. Even on that slippery surface, their combined weights were more than enough to hold the slightly built Helene. It was then that I made my mistake, my second mistake of that afternoon, though I did not realize that at the time. To help those above, I stooped to boost her up, and as I straightened abruptly, the suddenly increased pressure proved too much for the already crumbling bridge. I heard the ominous rumble, felt the snow begin to give under my feet, released my hold on Helene. She was already well clear anyway, grabbed Jackstraw by the arm and jumped for the other side of the bridge a second before the spot where we had been standing vanished with a room and went cascading down into the gloomy depths of the crevasse. At the full extent of my rope, I hit the ice on the far side of the crevasse, wrapped both arms tightly round Jackstraw. I heard his muffled expression of pain and remembered his injury for the first time, and wondered how long I could hold him when that side of the bridge went too, as go it must, its support on the far side no longer existing. But miraculously, for the moment it held. Both of us were pressed hard in against the ice, motionless, hardly daring to breathe, when I heard a sudden cry of pain from above. It came from Helene. She must have caught her injured shoulder as she was being pulled over the edge of the crevasse. But what caught my eye was not Helene, but Corazzini. He was standing very close to the edge, and he had my gun in his hand. I have never known such chagrin, such profound despair, such bitterness of spirit, or, to be utterly frank, such depths of fear. The one thing I had guarded against all the time, the one thing I had dreaded above all other things, that Jackstraw and I should ever find ourselves, at the same time, completely at the mercy of the killers, had come to pass. But even in my fear, there was savagery towards the man who had engineered this, so beautifully savagery towards myself for having been so easily and utterly fooled. Even a child could see how it had been done. The series of snow bridges had given Corazzini the idea. A little nudge to Helene Fleming at the right place. It was as plain as a pikestaff that it had been no accident, and it was a foregone conclusion that either Jackstraw or myself would have to go down to fix a rope round the youngster who, with her broken collarbone, would be unable to do it herself. I suppose the possibility that she might have crashed straight through the snow bridge must have occurred to Corazzini, but a man with a record of killings like he had wouldn't be worried unduly on that score. Annoyancy at the failure of his plan would probably have been his only reaction. And when one of us had gone down and the other was supervising the rescue from above, well, another little nudge would have solved all Corazzini's problems. As it was, I had played into his hands more completely than he could ever have hoped. Mouth dry, sweat breaking out in the palms of my clenched fists, and my heart going like a trip hammer in my chest, I was wondering desperately how he was going to administer the coup de grace when I saw the Rev. Smallwood approaching him, arms outstretched, and saying something I couldn't catch. It was a brave gesture of the little minister's, but a forlorn and hopeless one. I could see Corazzini change his gun to his left hand, strike Mr. Smallwood a heavy backhanded blow across the face, and the sound of a body falling on the ice above was unmistakable. And then Corazzini was waving the others back at the point of the gun, and was advancing towards the wooden battens that straddled the crevasse, and I knew with a dull certainty how he intended to dispose of us. Why waste 2 bullets when all he had to do was to kick the edges of these battens over the side, whether these battens, weighing 200 pounds between them, struck us or smashed away the last remaining buttress of the snow bridge, was quite immaterial. The point was that I was inescapably attached to them by the nylon rope around my waist, and when they plummeted down I would go with them, tearing away the bridge and carrying Jackstraw with me to our deaths in the unthinkable depths below. Despairingly, I considered the idea of snatching at the rifle still strapped to Jackstraw's back, but dismissed it even with the thought. It would take me seconds to get it off. There was only one thing for it, and it wasn't going to do me any good at all. With a jump, I could be halfway up the rope in a second. The increased weight would make the battens difficult to kick over, and while Corazzini was either pushing these or pumping bullets into me as I swarmed up the ropes, somebody's Zagero, so I could get him from the rear. That way there might, at least, be a faint chance for Jackstraw. I swung my arms behind me, bent my knees, then remained frozen in that ridiculous position as a rope came uncoiling down from above and struck me across the shoulder. I glanced up and saw Corazzini smiling down at me. "You 2 characters fixin' on staying down there all day? Come on up." It would be useless to try to describe the maelstrom of thoughts and emotions that whirled through my mind in the 90 seconds that elapsed before Jackstraw, and I stood once more in incredulous safety on the trail above. They ranged from hope to bafflement to wild relief to the conviction that Corazzini was playing a cat-and-mouse game with us, and no one thought was in my mind for more than seconds at a time. Even when I was safe, I still didn't know what to think. The overwhelming relief and gladness and reaction blotted out everything. I was trembling violently, and although Corazzini must have noticed it, he affected not to. He stepped forward and handed me the Beretta, but first, "You're a mite careless about where you stow your armory document. I've known for a long time where you kept this, but I guess it may have been fairly useful these last few minutes." But why dash? "Because I've got a damned good job and a chair behind a vice president's desk waiting for me in Glasgow," he snapped. "I'd appreciate the chance to sit in that chair someday." Without another word, he turned away. I knew what he meant, all right. I knew we owed him our lives. Corazzini was as convinced as I that someone had engineered the whole thing. It didn't require any thought at all to guess who that someone was. My first thought was for Jackstraw. Jackstraw, with a broken arm, was going to make things very difficult for me. It might well make things quite impossible. But when I'd worked his parka off, it required only one glance at the unnatural twist of the left arm to see that though Jackstraw had had every excuse for thinking his arm gone, it was, in fact, an elbow dislocation. He made no murmur, and his face remained quite expressionless as I manipulated the bone back into the socket, but the wide white grin that cracked his face immediately afterwards was proof enough of his feelings. I walked over to where Helene Fleming sat on the sledge, still shaking from the shock, Mrs. Dansby Gregg and Margaret Ross doing their best to soothe her. The uncharitable thought struck me that it was probably the first time that Mrs. Dansby Gregg had ever tried to soothe anyone, but I was almost ashamed of the thought as soon as it had occurred to me. "That was a close call, young lady," I said to Helene, "but all's well. Any more bones broken, eh?" I tried to speak jocularly, but it didn't sound very convincing. "No, Dr. Mason." She gave a long, shuddering sigh. "I don't know how to thank you, and Mr. Nielsen dash." "Don't try," I advised. "Who pushed you?" "What?" She stared at me. "You heard, Helene. Who did it?" "Yes, I -1 was pushed," she murmured reluctantly. "But it was an accident, I know it was." "Who?" I persisted. "It was me," Solly Levin put in. He was twisting his hands nervously. "Like the lady said, Doc, it was an accident. I guess I kinda stumbled. Someone tapped my heels and dash." "Who tapped your heels?" "For crying out loud." I'd made no attempt to hide the cold disbelief in my voice. What would I want to do a thing like that for? "Suppose you tell me," I said, and turned away, leaving him to stare after me. Zagero stepped in my way, but I brushed roughly past him and went up towards the tractor. On the sled behind, I saw the Rev. Smallwood sitting nursing a bleeding mouth. Corazzini was apologizing to him. "I'm sorry, Reverend. I'm really and truly sorry. I didn't for a moment think you were one of them, but I couldn't afford to take any chances back there. I hope you understand, Mr. Smallwood." Mr. Smallwood did, and was suitably Christian and forgiving. But I didn't wait to hear the end of it. I wanted to get through the Vindeby noon attacks and get through with as little loss of time as possible, preferably before it became dark. There was something that I knew now that I had to do, and as soon as possible, but I didn't want to do it while we were all teetering on the edge of that damn crevasse. We were through without further incident, and at the head of that long, almost imperceptible slope that fell away for thousands of feet towards the ice-bare rocks of the Greenland coast before the last of the noon twilight had faded from the sky. I halted the tractor, spoke briefly to Jack Straw, told Margaret Ross to start thawing out some corned beef for our belated midday meal, and had just seen Mahler, now semi-conscious, and Marie Lugard once again safely ensconced in the tractor cabin when Margaret Ross came up to me, her brown eyes troubled. "The tins, Dr. Mason, the corned beef. I can't find them." "What's that? The bully? They can't be far away, Margaret." It was the first time I'd called her that, but my thoughts had been fixed exclusively on something else, and it wasn't until I saw the slight smile touching her lips, if she was displeased she was hiding it quite well, that I realized what I had said. I didn't care, it was worth it. It was the first time I had ever seen her smile, and it transformed her rather plain face, but I told my heart that there was a time and a place for somersaults, and this wasn't it. "Come on, let's have a look." We looked, and we found nothing. The tins were gone, all right. This was the excuse, the opportunity one had been waiting for. Jack Straw was by my side, looking at me quizzically as we bent over the sled, and I nodded. Behind him, I murmured, I moved back to where the others were grouped round the rear of the tractor cabin and took up a position where I could watch them all, but especially Zagero and Levin. Well, I said, you heard. Our last tins of beef have gone. They didn't just vanish. Somebody stole them. That somebody had better tell me, for I'm going to find out anyway. There was an utter silence that was broken only occasionally by the stirring of the dogs on the tethering cable. No one said anything, no one as much as looked at his neighbor. The silence stretched on, then, as one man, they all swung round, startled at the heavy metallic click from behind them. Jack Straw had just cocked the bolt of his rifle, and I could see the slow stiffening of Zagero's back and arms as he realized that the barrel was lined up on his own head. "It's no coincidence, Zagero," I said grimly. I had my own automatic in my hand by the time he turned round. That rifle's pointed just where it's meant to. Bring your bag here. He stared at me, then called me an unprintable name. Bring it here, I repeated. I pointed the Beretta at his head. Believe me, Zagero, I'd as soon kill you as let you live. He believed me. He brought the bag, flung it at my feet. Open it, I said curtly. It's locked. Unlock it. He looked at me without expression, then searched through his pockets. At last he stopped and said, I can't find the keys. I'd expected nothing else. Jack Straw Dash, I changed my mind. One gun was not enough to cover a killer like Zagero. I glanced round the company, made my choice. Mr. Smallwood, perhaps you Dash? No, thank you, Mr. Smallwood said hastily. He was still holding a handkerchief to his puffed mouth. He smiled wryly. I've never realized so clearly before now how essentially a man of peace I am. Dr. Mason, perhaps Mr. Corazzini Dash. I glanced at Corazzini, and he shrugged indifferently. I understood his lack of eagerness. He must have known that I'd had him high up among my list of suspects until very recently indeed, and a certain delicacy of sentiment might well prevent him from being too forthcoming too soon. But this was no time for delicacy. I nodded, and he made for Zagero. He missed nothing, but he found nothing. After 2 minutes he stepped back, looked at me, and then thoughtfully at Solly Levin. Again I nodded, and again he began to search. In 10 seconds he brought out a bunch of keys and held them up. It's a frame-up, Levin yelped. It's a plant. Corazzini tnusta palmed him and put him there. I never had no keys, Dash. Shut up, I ordered contemptuously. Yours, Zagero? He nodded tightly, said nothing. Okay, Corazzini, I said. Let's see what we can find. The second key opened the soft leather case. Corazzini dug under the clothes on top and brought out the 3 corned beef tins. Thank you, I said. Our friend's iron rations for his takeoff. Miss Ross, our lunch. Tell me, Zagero, can you think of any reason why I shouldn't kill you now? You've made nothing but mistakes ever since I met you, Zagero said slowly, but, brother, this is the biggest you ever made. Do you think I would be such a damn fool as to incriminate myself that way? Do you think I would be so everlastingly obvious, Dash? I think that's exactly the way you expected me to think, I said wearily. But I'm learning. One more job, Corazzini, if you would. Tie their feet. What are you going to do? Zagero asked tightly. Don't worry. The executioner will collect his fee. From now on, you and Levin ride with your feet tied in the front of the tractor sled and with a gun on you all the time. What is it, Miss Lagarde?" "Are you sure, Peter?" It was the first time she had spoken for hours, and I could see that even that tiny effort tired her. "He doesn't look like a murderer." The tone of her voice accurately reflected the expressions of consternation and shocked disbelief on half a dozen faces. Zagero had spared no effort to make himself popular with everyone. "Does anybody here?" I demanded. The best murderers never do. I then explained to her and the others all I knew and had suspected about everything. It shook them, especially the facts of the spiking of the petrol and of Hillcrest having been, at one time, only a few hours behind us, and by the time I was finished I could see that there was as little doubt in their minds about Zagero's guilt as there was in mine. 2 hours later, well down the slope from the Vindeby noon attacks, I stopped and set up the radio gear. I reckoned that we were now less than 100 miles from the coast, and for half an hour tried to raise our base at Uplavnik. We had no success, but I had hardly expected any, the radio shack. At the base was manned only by one operator. He couldn't be expected to be on watch all the time, and obviously his call-up bell wasn't set for the frequency I was using. At 4 o'clock exactly I got through to Hillcrest. This time I hadn't bothered to move the radio out of hearing range. -1 was actually leaning against the tractor cabin as I spoke, and every word said, both by Hillcrest and myself, could be clearly heard. But it didn't matter anymore. The first thing I did, of course, was to tell him that we had got our men. Even as I spoke, my own voice sounded curiously flat and lifeless. I should, I suppose, have been exultant and happy, but the truth was that I had suffered too much, both physically and psychologically, in the past few days. Exhaustion lay over me like a smothering blanket. The reaction from the strain of those days was beginning to set in. The awareness was clearly with me that we weren't out of the wood by a long way yet. The lives of Marie Lagarde and Mahler were now the uppermost thoughts in my mind, and to be perfectly honest, I also felt curiously deflated because I had developed a considerable liking for Zagero, and the revelation of his true character had been more of a shock to me than I would have been prepared to admit to anyone. Hillcrest's reactions, I must admit, were all that could have been wished for, but when I asked him about his progress, the enthusiasm vanished from his voice. They were still bogged down, it seemed, and progress had been negligible. There was no word yet of passenger lists or of what the plane had carried that had been so important. The Triton, the aircraft carrier, had insulin aboard and would fly it up to Uplavnik. A landing barge was moving into Uplavnik through an ice lead and was expected to arrive tomorrow and unload the tractor it was carrying, which would move straight out to meet us. 2 ski planes and 2 search bombers had been looking for us, but failed to locate us. We'd probably been traversing the Vindeby noon attacks at the time. His voice went on, but I hadn't heard anything he'd said in the past minute or so. I had just remembered something I should have remembered a long time ago. "Wait a minute," I called. "I've just thought of something." I climbed inside the tractor cabin and shook Mahler. Fortunately, he was only asleep. From the look of him an hour or 2 ago, I'd have said the collapse was due any minute. "Mr. Mahler," I said quickly, "you said you work for an oil company?" "That's right." He looked at me in surprise. "Saucony Mobile Oil Co. in New Jersey." "As what?" There were 100 things he could have been that were of no use to me. Research chemist. Why? I sighed in relief and explained. When I'd finished telling him of Hillcrest's solution to his troubles, distilling the petrol, I asked him what he thought of it. It's as good a way as any of committing suicide, he said grimly. What does he want to do? Send himself into orbit. It only requires one weak spot in the can he's trying to heat. Besides, the evaporation range of petrol is so wide. Anything from 30 degrees centigrade to twice the temperature of boiling water, that it may take him all day to get enough to fill a cigarette lighter. That seems to be more or less the trouble. I agreed. Is there nothing he can do? Only one thing he can do, wash it. What size drums does your petrol come in? 10-gallon. Tell him to pour out a couple of gallons and replace with water. Stir well. Let it stand for 10 minutes, and then siphon off the top 7 gallons. It'll be as near pure petrol as makes no difference. As easy as that. I said incredulously. I thought of Hillcrest's taking half an hour to distill a cupful. Are you sure, Mr. Mahler? It should work, he assured me. Even the strain of a minute speaking had been too much for him. His voice was already no more than a husky whisper. Sugar is insoluble in petrol. It just dissolves in the small amounts of water present in petrol, small enough to be held in suspension. But if you've plenty of water, it'll sink to the bottom, carrying the sugar with it. If I'd the Nobel Science Prize, I'd give it to you right now, Mr. Mahler. I rose to my feet. If you've any more suggestions to make, for heaven's sake, let me know. I've one to make now, he smiled, but he was almost gasping for breath. It's going to take your friend a pretty long time to melt the snow to get all the water he needs to wash the petrol. He nodded towards the tractor sled, visible through the gap in the canvas screen. We're obviously carrying far too much fuel. Why don't you drop some off for Captain Hillcrest? Why? In fact, didn't you drop some off last night when you first heard of this? I stared at him for a long, long moment, then turned heavily for the door. "'Till tell you why, Mr. Mahler," I said slowly. "It's because I'm the biggest damned prize idiot in this world, that's why." And I went out to tell Hillcrest just how idiotic I was.
And that marks the end of the current chapter. Thank you for listening to The Book Reader. Stay tuned for the next episode tomorrow. Please subscribe for updates.